There is one idea that pagan Christianity has transferred onto millions of people, and that is that Christ was a friend of sinners. First of all, friend of sinners is how he was called by the people that were mocking him. Now, what was really happening was that Christ reached out to everyone that was around him. But look at this. He examined who those people were. There were prostitutes. There were criminals. There were all kinds of what you consider wrong people according to society. But Christ did not agree with their darkness. Christ did have contact with them, but Christ did not walk with them. You get what I'm saying here? Many of the people whom Christ healed in his ministry, he did not continue fellowshipping with them. Because even some of the people he healed did not become born again eventually. Some returned back to their old ways. Look, what Christ did was he walked in love towards everyone. To be an example unto us is how we ought to walk. But he did not walk in love with everyone. So Christ did not fellowship with everyone. He didn't. I mean, just think about this. Christ grew up in Nazareth, which was located in a ghetto at the time. Galilee, that district was not a pleasant place. Okay? People in ancient time knew this. It was a ghetto. It was like we would say today the hood. Well, Christ did not remain in the hood. While growing up, he learned the profession of his stepfather. He worked under him, and later he became a craftsman on his own. And he moved to Capernaum, where he had his job. Now, he didn't have an employment like we have today. You sign a contract, you go there at 9 and leave at 5. You didn't have that structure back then. So he was more like a semi-entrepreneur. Yes, he had a job, he worked for people, but there were times he had to go out and look for customers himself. So he was an undertaker, Christ. Yes, he had a job, but he was also an undertaker. He did not depend on his employer. So Christ had his job, he actually was involved in business, and he had his own place in Capernaum. When he began his ministry, whom did he pick? Simon was a fisherman. So he was active fishing. And he wasn't always that successful, but he kept on fishing. There were more fishermen that he picked up. Then you had Matthew, who was a tax collector. You also had a physician that he calls. So he called people from all walks of life, but those men were active. He, for the ministry of his kingdom, he did not pick people that didn't do anything. And Christ had 70 disciples. Now ask yourself this. If Christ really was a homeless beggar that had to receive donations from others, how could he have 70 disciples? Those 70 men need to eat every day. They may have wives and families at home. So how did Christ manage to have 70 disciples? It simply reveals that Christ was very successful in his craft. He was a craftsman. He was very successful, and eventually he gave up that job and that house in order to do his ministry. And he had to maintain and supply for those that ministered unto him. Of course, there were donations from other people for his ministry, but that came later on. And eventually, from the 70, only 12 remained. But the 12 that remained were all men that were active. Even Judas, who later betrayed him, was active. Judas was active in finances. And look at this. If you are a homeless beggar, as many pagan Christians think Jesus was, how could you have a treasurer, someone that manages finances? You don't manage finances if you don't have any finances. So Christ, in the success of his job, he fortune, and he spent that fortune on the promotion of the kingdom of God. You get what I'm saying here? So eventually, he was traveling from place to place, and people began to donate onto him. Eventually it happened, but Christ did not rely on his job, neither on that house he was living in. Now, does that mean now that you can't own a house? You can own a house, okay? But what Christ did was to teach us, okay? And all the men that Christ rode with were men that were active. There were women that began to follow Christ, and those women were also active. That's why they were able to sponsor Christ financially. I mean, when you look at Christ, he was very smart. I mean, Christ did not roll with everyone. Yes, he walked in love towards everyone, and when he could reach out to people, but he did not walk with everyone. Now look at getting twisted here. I'm not saying, like some of those prosperity preachers, that Christ was, like we would say, a millionaire living a luxurious lifestyle of ease. No. When he had his job, he had a job to pay for his rent and to pay for his expenses, but he also saved money to later use in his ministry. But that money would run out. Okay? He couldn't, he's God, okay? But as a human being, with a human resource, he couldn't pay all the 70 men year in, year out, every week. So the money he saved that he began to use for his ministry would run out one time. So that's why he rolled with men that were willing to get along with his vision, and they were active also. So it was only Christ that was active. Those men were also active economically. That brought in finances which would be spent on the ministry. Because listen to this, what if Christ would have picked up people that went to pubs often, because you had pubs back then, they went to the pubs and would drink all the time. All the cash he would get and he would spend on drinking. What if Christ would have picked up a drunkard for his ministry? Now, if the drunkard would eventually forfeit alcoholism and follow Christ, it would be different. But Christ only picked up people that were either active already or that decided to become active. If you notice something, there were people, when they encountered Christ, they wanted to become active for him. And he never turns them down, but he redirects them. Notice that, man. Christ did not walk with everyone. And look at this. We have folks today that claim to follow Christ. They call themselves Christian, or they call themselves believers. But when you look at their attitude is far from Christ's attitude. Listen, Christ didn't grow up in a luxurious environment. He didn't grow up in some middle-class household. He grew up in the hood. He grew up in the ghetto. Galilee was infested with crime, prostitution, violence. And the territory where he grew up in what they call the Middle East, was very contentious at the time. The Romans wanted to maintain order in the place because they needed it. The Greek population also wanted to preserve their heritage over there. You had the Israelites that wanted to preserve their heritage. You had the Samaritans who considered themselves Israelites but were not treated as such. Man, it was a very contentious place. And it was also important for trade because there was trade from that region going to Asia, to China, to India. So it was a very important international hub where that region where Christ grew up. I'm not talking about Galilee as a district. I'm talking about the whole region, the whole land of Canaan, which the Romans called Palestina. So there were also cartels over there, and criminal cartels that were operating to scam people. There were robbers on the streets. Man, Christ grew up. He grew up in the hood. But he did not remain in the hood, and he did not remain with a hood mentality. He moved. He was active. And he separated from the people that were not good for him. Christ knew that his relatives would not be good for him. He knew that those peers he grew up with would hijack his purpose. And listen to this, Christ is God. So he couldn't tell them he's the Most High. That would have shocked them. He knew that eventually those people wouldn't be able to understand him. Now you are not the Most High. So you don't have the same mission Christ had. Okay? That means dying in the place of the human race and rise again. That's not your purpose. Your purpose is to follow Christ. And even then you have a sub-purpose which the Lord has assigned for you. But even if you're not Christ himself, you are his follower. So you need to consider his wisdom in how he operated. Christ did not walk with everyone. The people he rolled with for his ministry, for his mission, were people that were active. And you know what? Even though those men, eventually 12, they were that remained with him, even though they had many faults, they had many wrong thinkings, and it could be annoying at times, those were the men he invested in, and it were those men after resurrection that being filled with the Holy Spirit, so now in agreement with Christ, they were so active that the Roman authorities and the nations within the Roman Empire, they couldn't deal with them. They even went outside the Roman Empire. They went to India, they went to Ethiopia. Some went to Britain before Britain was occupied by Rome. I mean, come on, man. Those men were active. The Apostle Paul, after his conversion, before his conversion he was active already, but he was deceived. He was persecuting God's people. After he became born again, he was very active for the kingdom. All those men were active. Many of the early converts, people that became born again, including many women, they were active. They didn't have the mentality to just go to their job every day and on Sundays they go to some buildings, sing praises, and that's it. They were active. Not only in having an income, but also financially they were relevant, so they could reach out onto others. Now don't get me wrong, they didn't rely on finances. You can read in the book of Acts that there was a time that one of the apostles arrived in a place and someone wanted help, and the apostle told her, I don't have gold and silver, but what I have I give unto you. So it wasn't as if they relied on money. The word times money ran out. The word times they were under attack. Sometimes they were robbed. All those things happened, but they were active. And because they were active, finances came to them when necessary. So with money or without money, they were active and prosperous. Money was just a tool. I'm saying currency. Better said, currency was just a tool unto them. And they used the tool wisely. But where am I heading with this message? Christ picked his company wisely. And that turns me to you. Do you have the same attitude as Christ? Because let me tell you, Christ had to allow Judas in his circle so that Judas would betray him, so that prophecy could be fulfilled. You don't have to fulfill prophecy like Christ did. So you don't need to have a Judas in your circle. Listen to what I'm saying here. Christ wants you to learn from his example. Okay? Maybe you didn't grow up in hood. Maybe you come from a middle class family, which was a bit more safe. Okay, that's good. Okay? You're not to blame for that. Okay? But even if you come from a much better milieu, you don't come from the hood like Christ was, still learn from his behavior. Learn from his attitude. Christ did not rely on his job. He did not rely on his income. He had a job. He had an income, but he used it as a tool. And the people he had around were people that were active also. Practical people. Okay? Look. Some of you, the reason why the Most High is withholding the manifestations of your prayers is not because you're not praying. It's not because of sin. It's not because of unrighteousness on your part. No, because you have received the righteousness of Christ that has been imputed onto you. Okay? The reason why the Most High is withholding the manifestation of some of your prayers is because you are not ready, or maybe not even willing, to deal with the consequences of your prayers being answered. You walk in the power of the Holy Spirit, right? When you decree things, because you decree it, there's power behind it. The Most High doesn't have to do anything himself. you walk in the power, and the power works when you operate in it. But there are times when the Spirit will withhold his power from working on your behalf, not to punish you, but because he, as Lord, sees you are not capable yet or not willing yet to deal with the manifestations of your prayers. You want me to give a parable? Okay, let me give a parable. It can be that indeed you want to be financially autonomous. Okay? It can be that indeed you don't rely on currency. You have currency and money. Currency is only money when you can use it in practice. For example, if you have Japanese yen and you live in South Africa, that Japanese yen is just currency, but you can't use it in practice in that society. So it's just currency, it's not money. But American dollars in the United States is both currency and money. The reason why it's money is because you can use it in practice. Now let's say you understand the difference between currency and money, and currency is just currency onto you. You don't love money. Okay? That's good, you have the right attitude. But let's say now you are decreeing and declaring that you have your own house somewhere in Spain, because you enjoy Spain. Spain's a lovely country. You want to reside there. You plan to marry some Spanish chick or some French chick and to live in Spain. Oh, great. I don't care what your age is. You're a man. You're still alive. So there's still life for you. Okay, I'm happy with your attitude. But here's the thing. You don't realize that some of those relatives of yours are wolves in sheep's clothing. The moment you decreed your own house in Spain, the moment you decreed the currency needed to purchase the house, the moment you decreed all of that, power was released. But because the Holy Spirit saw that after you got the house, you would invite your relatives over there, that your relatives would begin to haunt you with their negative energy, and that the woman you would get involved with would eventually get sick physically due to the psychic attacks of your relatives, but that you just couldn't see it because you trust your relatives, because the Holy Spirit saw all of that, he withheld your prayer from being manifested. You did not beg for an outcome like pagan Christianity taught you. You operate in power, you do decreed stuff. But the Lord withheld the manifestation to preserve you. Because if he would have let his power work out as you wanted, you would have gotten the house, you would have gotten the chick, you would have gotten that, but you would also have gotten a lot of persecution, and the chick would be involved with would eventually die before her time because you were not willing to guard your house against your relatives. You were still attached to those no good relatives. The reason why I say no good is because they refuse to agree with Christ. They hold on to poverty, they hold on to sickness, but you still want that fellowship with them. So because you're not willing to give them up, you're really still holding on to the world. Because their attitude is worldly. They hold on to toxic restrictions. So you can't bring them with you in your prosperity. And look at this. When Christ operated in prosperity, he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. And look at this. When he, during his ministry, returned to Capernaum, and people noticed the supernatural power working through him, they got offended. They wanted to kill him. There are two reports of him going back to Nazareth. In one report of he preached, they tried to throw him off a cliff. Now there weren't really cliffs over there in Nazareth that much. So what that means is people began to haunt him, wanted to kill him. And in the second account, they only got offended at him. There is some third account in the Gospels. Christ did this to show you why he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. Learn from that. Look, Christ wants you to be smart. And look at this. A lot of folks claim to follow Christ, but they're not smart as Christ is. They're pagans. I'm not talking about the pagan rulers that rule the world. I'm talking about pagans. They are benevolent pagans with good intentions that are far more practical than many believers. And those pagans, even though they don't follow Christ, they read the Bible, they read the New Testament, and they get inspired by Christ's example. And the little they put in practice of what they saw in Christ's attitude benefit them enormously. And then you have believers who hold on to the self-validation of society by going to church every Sunday to be called a good Christian and all of that. And they, man, they operate in self-destruction. I'm telling you, learn from Christ's attitude. Stop following the version of Christ that pagan Christianity taught you. Yes, eventually Christ did move around, go from place to place, without a permanent residence. But it was only after he materialized financial abundance. He was not a homeless guy dependent upon the goodwill of others. Now, according to society, he was homeless eventually, but even his homeless state was a blessed state. So was Christ ever homeless? Yes, he was. But not homeless in the sense that he was dying and perishing and nobody cared about him and he just had to put up with stuff, like common homeless people out here are. Christ was rich and he became poor for our sake, to reach us. Why? So that he could fellowship with us in our poverty? No, he became poor for our sake, so that we, through his poverty, would become rich. So Christ gave up his house, he gave up his job, and he committed to his ministry. So he became poor. According to the world, that was a financial step back, because all the money he saved during his job, all those years, he spent on the ministry. So now, yes, he did become dependent, but he operated in prosperity. And the reason he was poor like that is so that he could bring prosperity onto people. So even in a so-called homeless state, he was still prosperous. You know, you don't have to become quote-unquote homeless like Christ did during his ministry. Okay? You can own houses, own land, and all of that, as long as you use it for God's glory. Okay? Christ wants you out of materialism, which is bondage, so that you can operate in real prosperity. But many of you just aren't ready. You're not. Because there's still folks that mean you no good. There are folks who even mean themselves no good. There are folks who don't even trust themselves that you want to hold on to. Let them go. Lose them. Well, that's it for now. Agree with Christ and be at peace.